Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin, one of the challenges of linking an alien origin to any sort of UFO encounter is the fact that no astronomical phenomena has ever appeared in conjunction with any sort of UFO incident. However, a recent discovery may have changed all of that. Mysterious astronomical phenomena that has so far defied all natural explanation has been directly linked to the most famous mass UFO sighting in history. Get ready for the spookiest episode I have ever released on this channel, coming at you right now. Good afternoon and welcome to a very special episode of The Angry Astronaut. If you wanted to have a spooky New Year's experience, well, you've come to the right place because I have stumbled across an amazing story that was actually first discovered by a colleague of mine named John Michael Gaudier. His YouTube channel deals almost exclusively with astronomical phenomena that may have a technosignature type of origin, but he also talks about natural astronomical phenomena on his channel as well. Very responsible journalist. He definitely doesn't engage in any kind of sensationalism, and he does a lot of research when it comes to backing up his stories as far as scientific papers are concerned and such. And this particular story is linked to a phenomenal scientific paper that was released recently about the Mount Palomar photographic plates. Well, what are these? Well, let me give you a little bit of background first. In the effort of trying to discover strange astronomical phenomena, transients, in other words, events that happen in our sky that don't correspond to ordinary astronomical events, such as supernova that are more brief than the average supernova, or perhaps more bright, more energetic, or the flaring of various types of stars, or strange dimming of other stars, dimming that should not be taking place, based on the type of star that they might be. A wide variety of different unusual events that happen when we're talking about the stars in our sky. Well, a lot of the study that we try to do these days, at least with ground-based telescopes, well, that is immensely complicated by all the satellites in our night sky, and the problem is getting worse all the time. Now, of course, we do have a number of telescopes that are above the satellites at this point, but those telescopes are dedicated towards certain missions, certain objectives. Their time is valuable, and it's very difficult to get any sort of telescope time with these particular instruments, so many astronomers in their research are forced to consult with ground-based observatories and therefore are hindered by satellites. But what do you do about it? I mean, it's not like you can go to one of these observatories and turn back the clock to a time before we had satellites, can you? Well, actually, you can. At one of the most famous observatories in the world, the Mount Palomar Observatory, an immense collection of photographic plates were amassed over the years, many of them in the 1950s. And these particular plates were kept in storage for decades until they were finally gathered and digitized. Once this happened, a number of researchers got the idea that they had access to a fantastic telescope that had very impressive capabilities even back then, and so they could access this information, these photographic plates that this instrument had gathered over the years without the interference of satellites, because obviously the first satellite, Sputnik, did not fly until the late 1950s. So in 1952, 1953, you had all kinds of astronomical data that were completely clear of satellite interference. And it was in the process of studying these plates that a team of researchers stumbled across something very, very odd. And it turned out that these objects are not only unnatural, not only defy all natural explanation, They also may have a direct connection to one of the most famous mass sightings of UFOs in history. And to take it even further, they may have a connection to the strange phenomena that we have seen in the Tabby star system. Get ready for a very spooky tale. On the night of July 19th, 1952, the Mount Palomar Observatory, during a routine survey of the night sky, discovered what was called a triple transient. Although at the time, the astronomers had no idea that it was there. It was simply recorded onto a photographic plate and went unnoticed for 7 decades until it was discovered by a research team that had been going over the digitized copies of the photographic plates taken by the Mount Palomar Observatory all those years ago. The results were published in a paper called A Bright Triple Transient That Vanished Within 50 minutes. The paper is linked in the description. In this paper, 3 15th magnitude point sources within 10 arc seconds of each other. In other words, a closely clustered group of 3 star-like objects appeared and then vanished, disappearing completely from view, even though the telescope had a capacity to observe objects as dim as magnitude 21. That being the case then, whatever these objects were, they either simply went away or they dimmed to a degree unparalleled in astronomical history. There is simply no precedent for stars behaving this way. 3 stars flaring simultaneously and then dimming practically simultaneously as well. Now, if you're thinking that this simply could be damage to photographic plates that are 70 years old, well, the researchers thought of this as well, and they know what damage looks like, or radiation exposure can sometimes affect these plates also. This does not appear to be either of those kinds of scenarios. That being the case then, the researchers are confident that what was observed was 3 closely packed objects that were only briefly in view of the telescope and then simply vanished from sight. This is completely inconsistent with anything that has ever been observed in the past. If it was a passing asteroid or some other object in low Earth orbit, well, first of all, the movement of such objects should have been observed on a time exposure plate, yet they were not. And then on top of that, we are not aware of a tightly grouped pack of 3 asteroids in low Earth orbit or in near Earth orbit anyway. So what about aircraft? Well, that's another problem because aircraft are obviously in motion and these are time exposure plates. That being the case then, the movement of aircraft would have been plainly observed. No, these are objects that apparently were separated by no more than 6 astronomical units from one another. And not only that, given the nature of causality and the speed of light, they had to have been very close. According to the researchers, a maximum of 2 light years away, but a minimum of geosynchronous orbit. Now let's get another possibility out of the way that some of you may be thinking of right now, and that is the idea of gravitational lensing. That we are not actually looking at 3 objects, but rather one, that because of the influence of the light bending effects of something between us and the objects in question, perhaps a black hole or something else with massive gravitational influence, that might make a supernova explosion appear to be 3 simultaneous supernova explosions taking place right next to one another. This, however, was also dismissed by the researchers simply because there is no precedent for any sort of gravitational lensing supernova event, or stellar flare for that matter, that lasts less than 1 hour. This is a mystery of titanic proportions, and I'm rather surprised actually that the media hasn't grabbed hold of this a lot more enthusiastically than they have, because this is an unprecedented discovery, regardless of what it might be. But let's look at artificial explanations. One possibility proposed by John Michael Gautier is that this could be 3 photon rockets being engaged simultaneously, perhaps as a braking maneuver of 3 objects entering our solar system. However, a photon rocket, which is kind of a light sail with an onboard nuclear reactor that produces the photons that provide the thrust, well, that should have produced a lot more light than these objects would suggest. Unless, of course, the braking maneuver was being applied further out in the solar system than geosynchronous orbit. And keep in mind, if 3 objects or 3 photon rockets were directly approaching our planet, they wouldn't appear to move in a photographic plate, and they also would have disappeared when the braking maneuver was completed, which could very well have taken less than 1 hour. However, regardless of what these objects might have been, and by the way, I find the light sail or photon rocket explanation to be extremely compelling, especially when you consider that that's what some people think Oumuamua might have been as well. There are a couple of other very strange details about the appearance of these objects that are downright spooky. First of all, keep in mind the date, July 19th, 1952, but also the location. Right ascension, 21 hours, 18 minutes, 10.4 seconds. Declination, positive 50 degrees, 22 minutes, 43.4 seconds. This, by the way, is very close to the direction that Tabby star lies in. It's not exactly the same direction, and of course that makes a big difference, but keep in mind, a recent discovery suggests that Tabby star is actually part of a cluster of stars, all of which seem to exhibit the same kind of strange, unnatural dimming, inconsistent with the presence of a planetary system, and more consistent with the presence of some sort of strange technosignature or alien megastructure. But if you want to get into that, well, I have a video linked at the end of this one about that particular topic. But spooky indeed that if we had artificial objects approaching our planet, they might be approaching from a region of space where there might be an interstellar civilization that we have already detected. That being the case, though, let's go back to the date, July 19th, 1952. On the night of that particular date, something very strange happened in the vicinity of Washington, D.C., one of the most famous mass sightings of UFOs in history. At 11:40 p.m. on Saturday, July 19th, 1952, by the way, almost 24 hours after these objects appeared in the Mount Palomar plates, an air traffic controller at Washington National Airport spotted 7 objects on his radar. By the way, the fellow's name that detected these objects was Edward Nugent. The objects were located approximately 24 kilometers south-southwest of D.C., and no known aircraft were in the area. The objects were not following any sort of recognizable flight path. Nugent's superior, Harry Barnes, who was the senior air traffic controller at the airport, watched the objects on his radar scope, and he later wrote, "We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft." Shortly after this detection, all hell broke loose. Objects began to appear in all sectors of the radar scope. They moved over the White House and the Capitol building. Barnes, terrified, called Andrews Air Force Base, and although they didn't have anything on their radar, an airman called the base's control tower to report the sighting of a strange object. Airman William Brady, who was in the tower, then said that he saw an object which looked like an orange ball of fire trailing a tail unlike anything I had ever seen before. And as he tried to tell other personnel in the tower, the object suddenly took off at unbelievable speed. At the same time, at one of National Airport's runways, S.C. Pierman, a Capital Airlines pilot, was waiting in the cockpit of his DC-4 for permission to take off, and then suddenly he spotted what he believed to be a meteor. He was told that the control tower's radar had detected unknown objects closing in on his position. The pilot then observed 6 objects, white, tailless, fast-moving lights over a 14-minute period. The control tower was in contact with Pierman the entire time, and according to them, quote, each sighting coincided with a pip we could see near his plane. When he reported that the light streaked off at high speed, it disappeared on our scope. Meanwhile, at Andrews Air Force Base, the control tower personnel were now tracking something on their radar. Some thought them to be unknown objects, but others suspected, and they are able to prove it actually, that they were just stars and meteors. Imaginations were beginning to run wild, I believe, with some of these people. However, Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport observed an orange-red light to the south, and the light would appear to stand still and then make an abrupt change in direction and altitude. This happened, according to him, several times. And then at one point, both the radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews Air Force Base were tracking an object hovering over a radio beacon. And then the object suddenly vanished at all 3 radar centers at the same time. 2 U.S. Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters from the Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware were dispatched. However, they found nothing, ran low on fuel, and left. And when they left, the objects returned, which convinced Barnes that, quote, the UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and behaving accordingly, unquote. The event caused a national sensation. It's interesting how quickly we have forgotten what happened back in the early 1950s, but it made national news in a very big way. But the story got even stranger because on the night of July 26, 1952, the objects were back. A pilot and stewardess on a National Airlines flight into Washington observed some lights above their plane, and within minutes of the sighting, both radar centers at the National Airport and at Andrews Air Force Base were tracking UFOs once again. This time, United States Air Force Master Sergeant Charles Cummings, so another witness here, he observed the objects at Andrews and said, quote, these lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There were no trails. They traveled faster than any shooting star I have ever seen. Meanwhile, Project Blue Book was investigating the situation. The press was all over the radar scopes and the various airport facilities where these objects were being tracked, but Project Blue Book would not allow the press to photograph the radar screens. And this time, fighter craft were again dispatched, F-94 Starfire jet fighters again, and this time a wingman of the flight leader, a 1 Lieutenant William Patterson, spotted 4 white glows and gave chase. Quote, I tried to make contact with the bogies below 1,000 feet. I was at my maximum speed, but I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them. And according to the press secretary for Project Blue Book, ground control asked Patterson, quote, if he saw anything, and he replied, quote, I see them now and they're all around me. What should I do? And nobody answered because nobody had the slightest damn idea what to tell him. This is a famous UFO mass sighting, one that was confirmed by multiple radar sets and by quite a number of military personnel and experienced pilots. But now we have an astronomical phenomena that took place less than 24 hours prior to the event. A phenomena that defies all natural explanation, and a phenomena that may have come into our solar system from a region of space that corresponds to an interstellar civilization. If you'd like to get more information on Tabby Star and the other phenomena that I've been talking about in this video, well, I have all of that linked at the end of this video. Also, if you'd like to own this amazing image on a t-shirt or a poster poster or maybe on a coffee mug, well, you can still get a 10% discount by using the code ANGRY23 in my store, linked in the description. But this is only good through New Year's Day. And by the way, the team studying these photographic plates are coming up with more amazing discoveries all the time. Again, devoid of any satellite interference, so it's some pretty unique stuff. I'll continue to track the various papers that this team releases and bring the information to you as rapidly as I possibly can. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, please subscribe, and until the UFO mystery is solved once and for all, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.